Hey all, hi, Mike Watson here again with another edition of the Frankfurt School today, which is broadcast on the Acid Left and on Zero Books. And I have with me Matt McManus, a professor of law and society at the University of Calgary and also author of The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism with Palgrave and co-author of two books, What is Postmodern Conservatism and Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, both from Zero Books, and more recently, a critical legal examination of liberalism and liberal rights, again from Palgrave. So very active on the publishing front there. So Matt is very familiar to our viewers. He obviously has been doing a lot of work around liberalism and emerging populist trends. So great to have him here. We're going to talk a little bit about basically this book here that we have up, Adorno, The Jargon of Authenticity, which was written or published, I think, in '65, which makes it one of Adorno's last books. He published Negative Dialectics after this, and his aesthetic theory was actually published after he died and was actually completed from notes of his, so it was unfinished. So this is one of the last two unfinished works. It gets overlooked quite a bit, I think, because it's very specific in its critique of existentialism and of Heidegger. Basically, Adorno talks of jargon, both advertising and kind of propaganda jargon, so words that are used to kind of confound and confuse the public, to get them to buy stuff or to acquiesce to the ruling class kind of vision. And jargon as used particularly by Heidegger, but also by other people who are considered to be existentialists, such as Sartre. And basically this jargon, which is very vague, things like Dasein, which means kind of like being in the world, or sometimes I heard something like thing being, but kind of a word meaning being used by Heidegger, but really used to suggest there's a kind of a form of like just being, and we should be trying to just be in a way that I suppose evokes spirituality, particularly Eastern mysticism. But Adorno says that that's very vague, and it kind of leaves a big gap in which kind of right-wing politics can then kind of move in. That being his kind of main critique of Heidegger there, or one of his main critiques of Heidegger. Of course, Heidegger was a Nazi party member, so I think this comes partly into it. We'll get into that later, because Adorno was a Jew who fled Nazi Germany during World War II, during Nazi rule. So I think, obviously political undertones there. So there's a lot to kind of unravel. But okay, first thing. So Matt, you said to me you wanted to discuss existentialism and the Frankfurt School. As I asked you, what would you discuss if you were going to discuss the Frankfurt School? Why do you think that's important? Do you see some kind of emergent existentialism or other kind of trend similar to that needs kind of pushing back against today? And why would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that has been very distinctive about 21st century thought has been a renewed interest in the critique of existentialism by various Marxist and Marxist adjacent thinkers, and a renewed recognition that many of the existentialist thinkers, Nietzsche, Heidegger in particular, but there are some other minor ones, Karl Jaspers, for example, had distinctly right-wing sympathies, right? And what's kind of important about this is you can see the impact of these kind of right-wing strains of existentialism and many different contemporary figures, either on the center right or on the far right. Jordan Peterson is probably the most famous example of this. If you think about his replete references to people like Soren Kierkegaard, Martin Heidegger, Friedrich Nietzsche, but you can also see it in lesser figures, like, for instance, Steve Bannon was very influenced by Heidegger. On the far right, you have people like Alexander Dugin, author of The Fourth Political Theory, which is basically just defense of kind of Russian fascism. So I think Adorno's critique is still very much worth looking at, both to try to get intellectual ammunition to target these guys, but also to try to understand why it is genealogically they would be attracted to these kind of figures, since they offer a lot of intellectual resources to try to argue for right-wing positions. Sorry, Mike, I can't hear you.
Okay, so yeah, one of the main things about existentialism, as I see it, is it emerging out of World War II, although Heidegger's writings came from before then, or as being a nothingness. But being and time. But kind of the main kind of bulk of what we call existentialism emerges out of World War II, with, I guess, people really struggling, and the need to that being perhaps that we, I guess, reach deep inside ourselves and kind of use our own will to construe our own subjectivity. So this kind of feeling that, you know, people felt like objects. They felt objectified by the experience of war, industrialization, etc. But the remedy being a kind of secular religion, in that you would somehow just magic up a belief in your own freedom. I think people are looking for something like that today, or certainly people feel lost. So, you know, there's a situation where people are drawing perverse narratives around, for example, the Democrats and Satanism, drinking people's blood, etc. But I think that is, you know, is an indication of people feeling really lost and wanting something to believe in. But other than that, I think kind of a move towards New Age spirituality indicates people wanting to kind of will and meaning to life. Do you see this as a current problem that maybe, you know, is this maybe what you're kind of driving against when you say there are things that parallel the rise of existentialism today?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting the roots of existentialism go back really as far as you want to trace them, right? I mean, some people would go back to Sartre, like you said. Others would go back further to Nietzsche. Walter Kaufmann, amongst others, characterized Kierkegaard as the father of existentialism, right? But you could even go further back to, you know, somebody like maybe Goethe in the Stories of Young Werther, Immanuel Kant with the emphasis on transcendental subjectivity. Who knows, right? For the purposes of this book, the primary existential genealogy Adorno draws is between Kierkegaard and Heidegger, Heidegger being the main target, right? But he does emphasize that even in the works of somebody like Kierkegaard, you see two features that could mend themselves very easily towards supporting reaction, right? One is this kind of emphasis on a kind of hyper-individualism that's not particularly social and that kind of elevates itself above the morass of material reality, right? And the other thing that's important, of course, is Kierkegaard leveled a very interesting critique of what he called the present age. And his characterization of the present age wasn't one that would really be very amenable to leftists, because he was concerned about what he called the leveling effects of modernity, right? This idea that everyone now had an opinion, no matter how crass and vulgar it happened to be. And he was very critical of mass media for that reason, right? Now, this isn't to kind of dismiss Kierkegaard, since I think there are a lot of interesting things about this critique. But Adorno points out it's not hard to see how this idea that we live in a modern age characterized by leveling would be very amenable to certain kind of right-wing figures, right? Flash forward to somebody like Heidegger, right? And Adorno says that's exactly what you see happen, right? A lot of the more elitist tendencies within existential thought or proto-existential thought, depending on how you want to characterize it, kind of bubble up to the foreground. Except with Heidegger, what you see, interestingly enough, is a lot of this kind of individualist elitism in Kierkegaard, given a social twist, yes, but one that moves in the direction of nationalism and this kind of blood and soil type conception of authenticity. And this is why he characterizes it as a jargon, first and foremost, because Adorno, I think rightly, doesn't want to grant these kinds of sentiments about blood and soil and nationalism intellectual respectability by implying that they're really all that, right? He talks about how, in fact, what Heidegger often does is employ these very flowery, even neutral sounding terms in order to vindicate what's ultimately an extremely reactionary, revanchist, and even kind of sentimental form of politics that ultimately had disastrous effects if you look at the 20th century. Yeah,
I want to kind of just go into that a little bit, where Adorno is against the kind of ruralism or the kind of fetishization of the rural, what we might call the rustic, by Heidegger. So Heidegger basically says that, you know, industrial life has led people to have a kind of poor relationship with their being and with time. So he characterizes human life as being defined by the fact that we're aware of time, and particularly of our mortality, which I suppose we can't deny. But then he says that something about the kind of pace of modern industrial life has led us to like lose the ability to live in the moment, kind of as beings in ourselves. I mean, that's not really wrong, I don't think. But, you know, there it gets to where he kind of talks about how rural people, he kind of romanticizes about perhaps a point in history, but and also about some people living at that time have perhaps the ability to live in the moment, whereas urban people don't have that ability. But isn't that idea like quite common anyway? Like even today, particularly around, I guess, post-middle-aged people get to a certain age and they like embrace gardening or whatever. I mean, is that inherently bad? Because I get a lot of this this kind of wanting to return to the soil. There's nudism, again, this fetishization of the rural, being defined as inherently right-wing, and sometimes this kind of thing where you get a leftist that starts to say things about nature, and people will say, look, they're kind of flipping, they're becoming fascist or going red-brown or whatever. I mean, what do you think about that? Because we can't surely, like, you know, imagine that anyone into nature must be fascist.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two components to this, right? One issue that Adorno takes issue with superficially, but I think it's actually worth noting, is precisely the way that many right-wing thinkers try to present this emphasis on ruralism, localism, and the nationalism associated with all those things as not necessarily political, right? And this is where the jargon element of the jargon of authenticity comes in, right? There's this idea that, look, you know, we're just describing the way things really are, and it's depoliticized. In fact, you know, if you think about just an emphasis on things like gardening or being in a local village near a mountain or whatever, it doesn't seem immediately political, right? But of course, Adorno emphasizes that it actually is, right? Because what you see in the work of the people who defend these kinds of positions, whether you're talking about Heidegger or moving forward to people like Steve Bannon, for example, is this idea that quite conservative rural figures represent the real soul of the nation, or they have a more authentic relationship to existence than modern urban people who live in pluralistic cities, who embrace liberal or leftist values, and who engage in kind of decadent forms of activities, right? That's the implicit kind of often understated, but sometimes very overstated dimension to this emphasis on rural life, right? And, you know, Adorno says, you know, you can also see this attempt to kind of depoliticize these sentiments, even as early as something like Be in Time, which presents itself in many ways as a kind of neutral analysis of the existential phenomenology of human life, a kind of philosophical anthropology. But if you look at like Heidegger's actual references in the last part of that book to who happens to be inauthentic, it's always Das Man living in a big city like Berlin, defined by things like emergent feminist movements, acceptance and tolerance of LGBTQ individuals, smoking jazz, all this stuff that he associates with modernity and wants to reject. Whereas the kind of authentic people are rural individuals living in small German towns who disdain all that kind of stuff. And of course, form the kind of petty bourgeois core of what's eventually going to become the NSDAP kind of bloc, as it were.
Yeah, I suppose there's that sense that it's very hard to get to kind of untouched nature unless you have quite a lot of money and time, and time being money. You know, but also the way that so many like just amazing views have already been built on, already have villas there. If you go to like Capri in Italy or somewhere,
yeah.
You know, so I can get that point. And
I mean, think about like all these rich North Americans, right? What do they do when they want time off? You know, they go to the cottage over the weekend to reconnect with nature, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it requires like a certain amount, a certain degree of privilege. Sometimes family money, sometimes money people have made in their life, but it ties into industrial capitalism, having that money in the first place. And Adorno, of course, talks generally throughout his work of first and second nature. The first nature being nature that we try and get away from as humans, that we try and kind of supersede, because, you know, however you feel about nature itself, you know, whether or not you're scared of like lightning and volcanoes, nature is the thing that will kill us. So, you know, there is a first nature we try and get away from, but then we build this second nature. So, you know, technology, industry, etc., ends up repeating, I suppose, the inherent kind of tendency towards death of first nature. So the exploitation wrought by second nature, i.e. like industrial scale warfare, is just a kind of repetition of nature's death drive, although I don't know that Adorno uses the term death drive, but I think he's aware of that coming down from Freud. So yeah, I think that certainly, yeah, that's probably what Adorno's driving at. And yeah, he's kind of very wary of over-romanticizing nature. But I just want to move on there. Well, actually, I want to go back a little bit, because there is this thing of, we touched upon in the first question I asked, and that is existentialism post-World War II being about willing freedom. So you're a subject, you feel that you're barely a subject, you're trying to be a subject, you're somehow part of this, industrial capitalist complex. And existentialism says basically, yeah, life is pretty crappy, but you can kind of will an existence, you can will a meaning. What is wrong with that? I mean, because kind of like playing devil's advocate here, but where exactly are we going to get the meaning from if we don't somehow along the line will it?
I mean, it's a fascinating question, and we can spend all day talking about this, right? And I think the way that we can begin to deconstruct this question is by looking at the distinction between a kind of existential psychology focused on something like authenticity, which Adorno is very critical of, and a kind of dialectical ontology coupled with a Freudian kind of approach to psychoanalysis, which is, of course, the kind of approach that Adorno himself favored, although not without complications, right? So from Adorno's reading, and I think there are problems with this, by the way. I don't think we should just uncritically accept his reading of all branches of existentialism. The primary problem with the jargon of authenticity is that it focuses on kind of willing immediately to be yourself, right? And the argument is typically, again, depoliticized in the philosophical anthropologies put forward by people like Heidegger. But of course, the political intention is fairly clear, right? Once you strip away all the corrupting influences of modernity and their kind of impact upon you, get back to something like the soil, right, and your rootedness in the world, then you'll be able to will your authentic self without all these kind of decadent forces influencing you, right? And there's an inherent nostalgia in this idea, right, as well, because there's this notion that once upon a time we were able to lead more authentic lives, but now we can't because of, again, the leveling influence of modernization, right? Adorno, as a dialectician, is a lot more subtle from my point of view, right? Where he says, first off, this notion that you could be, I'll just give it a quick example, more authentic in a small town, attached to the soil, is pretty bizarre, right? When you think about all the weight of traditionalism and the way that influences people to behave in certain ways and even to be unthinking about it. And this is a point he takes from somebody like Max Weber as well, right? But more than that, we need to understand that the dialectic of modernity doesn't constitute a regression from a kind of pre-modern era. The reason we have modernity is there were elements in traditional forms of life that eventually birthed the modern world, right? Through this dialectical process. So this idea that we can make a sharp juxtaposition between what was and what is, of course, characteristic of undialectical thinking, right? This idea that there's some break and decline, right? Now, this isn't to say that we should be uncritical of modernity, obviously, right? Adorno is more critical of modernity than anyone else, but we need to be future-minded, right? Rather than past-minded, and recognize that if we are going to be emancipated, it means that we're going to need to create a much more kind of leftist society in the future. What that looks like, he never really spells out, of course, right? Where we produce together and where a lot of the kind of libidinal distortions that characterize our life in the world today and lead to so much suffering are smoothed out because we're able to offer each other the kind of mutual recognition we live in a society of equals, right? So a very, very, very different kind of take on this. And I think ultimately a more accurate take than what you find in Heidegger and other existential authors of the type that Adorno criticizes.
Yeah, I mean, Adorno has this kind of line, which I've used a few times, or I've referred to a few times in essays and books, where basically he says that there can be no poetry after Auschwitz, and it kind of really means no art as such after the horrors of World War II. But then says later certainly when he says it in the essay on commitment, written in the early 60s, although he says it actually in earlier essays as well, but when he says in that essay, there can be no poetry after Auschwitz, or literally no lyric poetry after Auschwitz, he later says we have to keep on making it anyway so that we don't surrender to cynicism. So he's kind of saying art is impossible, but our only hope is art. But the thing there is it has a material context, and he believes that art somehow can withstand the kind of untruths of capitalism. So in capitalism, you get these objects which kind of entice people to behave in certain ways. So basically the commodity fetish, as Marx would have it, that the objects start to basically control humans in a way, even though we're responsible for making them. Because we read certain properties, we kind of interpret it, they can give us certain things like make us more attractive or intelligent or whatever. And then Adorno basically says that artworks, being a special type of object, do the same thing, but their trick is they can pretend to be completely free of the whole system. So they act as exemplars of how we might stand outside capitalism long enough to critique it, only momentarily. But in that moment, we might see a glimpse of truth. But it's entirely material. So he's kind of saying we can just kind of like evoke the truth through the artwork if we try hard enough. Is very different from the existentialist. I think the kind of very crude kind of existentialist interpretation. I think the kind of layman's interpretation of existentialism, to be fair, but that one is going to suffer, but suffering is a lot, but you can just somehow from that pull out some kind of satisfaction from life, or dedicate yourself to something enough to find some kind of value. But the question there comes, how is that going to happen in the face of material conditions, capitalist material conditions? That's what I guess Adorno is critiquing Heidegger for, because there's no answer there. Like, it's like we just can suddenly magically extricate ourselves from society long enough to be happy. So it's kind of very unfulfilling. I mean, it's almost, I don't know if you see it, I mean, it's certainly been pointed out, I think, by people, a kind of Eastern mystical type aspect, Buddhist type aspect to Heidegger, which isn't really an answer to it for anyone. That one could just go away into, some kind of rural haven and everything would be okay, because that, is only going to work if it's going to work for everyone. There just isn't probably enough space. Once everyone is like on your doorstep in your rural kind of idyll, it's no longer a rural idyll.
Absolutely. And I mean, I have to say that I think your new book, The Meaning of Mark Fisher, makes this point really well. Which is that Adorno isn't entirely consistent on his own interrogation of art, right? Every now and then he does lapse into a kind of nostalgia himself, talking about, why it is the Beatles are, the worst thing to ever happen to music. And, what was it again? Classical music died with, who was it? Bach or something?
That's for sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but if he said who he said that about, you might be right, but certainly when he pulls out examples of things that
I think it was Chopin. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, my bad.
When he talks about examples of artistic moments that can really kind of evoke truth, he says things like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and you just think, well, how can that be the case? Especially because he talks about artworks that can really evoke the new, or that are so radically different that they shock you out of your normal complacency under capitalist conditions. So when he says that, then talks about Beethoven's Ninth, you just think, something here doesn't quite add up. So yeah, Adorno does have his reactionary moments, and he's kind of, I think he can be accused certainly of quasi-spiritualism and of embracing the past, because he does talk about how the experience of looking at a radically abstract artwork, which breaks you out of your normal kind of false conditions that you live in under capitalism, returns you to the experience of the first man or primeval man looking at horror, a lightning storm or something. So you think, well, that is kind of, that's kind of odd. At that point, you kind of feel similar to when you read Heidegger at points as well. But I think, with Adorno, you have to keep reading on, and dialectic of enlightenment is very dense. But if you keep reading on, you find that it's actually much more nuanced than that. Enlightenment is much more nuanced, and more what I outlined earlier about the material aspect of looking at art, and materialist aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you're absolutely correct that Adorno had his reactionary moments, as we all do. Nobody's immune from the pleasures of nostalgia, right? Even those of us who militate against it and try to compel ourselves not to think that way. But I think absolutely that if you look at the core of his work and what it's aiming at, it's very much not nostalgic kind of aesthetics, right? And one of the things that he's critical of Heidegger and other kind of right-wing existentialists for in the jargon of authenticity is precisely the fact that the only way that they can conceptualize an aestheticized world is through the lens of nostalgia, right? In particular, he points out that if you see all the kind of references in Heidegger, it's almost always to either ancient Greece and the classical period, right? Or to something in 19th century Germany. right? These are the kind of two golden ages of European civilization, and everything that's come afterwards is a decline. And what we need to do is try to recapture that essence. And Adorno points out that this is, of course, exactly what the Nazis tried to do, the NSDAP, right? With this kind of bombastic neoclassicism a la Germany, right? And it produced some of the most vulgar, disgusting art you could ever possibly imagine, right? Completely unimaginative, driven exclusively by a kind of nostalgic politics, and of course, politically not just deviant, but put to the purposes of extraordinary exploitation and ultimately evil, right? And so Adorno doesn't want us to do anything like that. He's interested in the idea of a kind of emancipated art that could emerge if we extricate ourselves from the strictures, as you called it, of the culture industry. What that looks like and how it wouldn't be nostalgic, I don't think he ever really gives us a very clear example, right? Sometimes he tends to flirt with people like Kafka, for example, saying, well, this might be pointing in the right direction, but I think it's incumbent upon us to try to develop a more positive and constructive Adornian theory of art.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. Yeah, well, partly because things are just so different today than when he was writing up to the late 60s. But also, I think Adorno, when he says that art that is somehow radically new, that can't be interpreted, that you can't discern what it is, he's talking about an effect that art produces in the viewer or listener. Therefore, it's possible for art that's 200 years old to be new if it's evoking newness, if it's kind of breaking with the lifelessness and drudgery of capitalism. So I don't think it's really a contradiction that he talks about Beethoven. He's talking about a very dissonant moment, a musical passage in the Ninth Symphony that has the capacity to shock people. And basically, Adorno's whole system kind of revolves around the fact that as humans, we tend to try and control and measure and categorize things, and that's kind of where we fall down. That categorization leads to capitalism and exploitation of each other. So he kind of argues that in music, in which there's no discernible element you can measure or control, you in listening to that or watching that music, watching a piece of art, looking at it, you are kind of snapped out of this tendency to categorize. And so, yeah, that can happen equally with an old piece or a new piece of music, but the point is that it will evoke a moment of newness in the subject, or a moment of subjectivity, so to speak. So I don't really see any contradiction really in that for Adorno, but he's talking about artworks, that shock and kind of turn society upside down. Now, he himself wouldn't turn society upside down. That's the whole thing about Adorno. Because obviously about him not backing his student uprising in 1969 in Germany, and generally not backing revolution after World War II, because he just thought it might revert back into the kind of horrors we saw in World War II. But he does believe in artworks turning the kind of subject upside down, or the objectified subject upside down, even if he thinks that experience will only be momentary. But I think partly because for him it's only momentary, it's safe. Because if you have a kind of revolutionary consciousness which is ongoing and leads people to kind of actually try and start revolution, his theory is that as long as we have a basically faulted way of thinking, we will revert back into totalitarianism.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think this is one of the distinctive things about this book, why it's useful, because as you pointed out, it was a book that was produced late in Adorno's life, right around the same period, just prior to when he produced his big masterpieces, the books that kind of made his name aside from Dialect of Enlightenment. And so he's really engaged with a lot of these questions in a very active way. And one of the things that he's repelled by during the 1950s, 60s is precisely the fact that despite the association of the jargon of authenticity with Nazism, it nonetheless becomes very appropriated by various countercultural movements within Germany and elsewhere, right? Which includes, he thinks very bizarrely, the resuscitation of Heidegger's reputation. And that wasn't, again, just in Germany. You can think about like the beat authors in the United States of America, very influenced by his work, all the kind of 1960s figures who were deeply inspired by him. And part of him, of course, when he's writing this is just saying, isn't this bizarre, right? You have this crotchety old Nazi figure who talked about how everything in modernity must go, as it were, and we need to return. And now all of a sudden, he's being reappropriated for these purposes, right? And Adorno thinks that there's something deeply wrong with that because while the jargon of authenticity can superficially seen perform the function you just described of compelling us to look back in order to shock us into the recognizing the vulgarity of modernity, right? Its consequences are almost always to push people toward reactionary forms of politics, right? To assume, very simply that, we need to return to something like this. Whereas, of course, what he wants is the past in this very dialectical way to provoke the new, the newly emergent, right? Now, again, I'm not exactly sure that he ever lays out specifically what form this is going to take. In some ways, it's actually precluded, since if he says, do this, right, that's kind of giving you a set of instructions or guidelines about how to produce the kind of art he wants, in which case people are just going to instrumentalize that set of recommendations and go about doing that, right? It's one of the perils of dialectical thinking. You can't just sit there and create recipes for the cookshops of the future, right? But I think that we can see examples of figures that try to be inspired by Adornian art. If we look at things like experimental film, if we look at things like some of the better postmodern novels of the 1970s, people like Philip K. Dick, for example, right? All of these figures that try to develop new aesthetic styles to compel us to think through the limitations of modernity and then postmodernity, and don't give up the optimistic hope that there is a better world that remains possible, right?
Yeah, I think he would have embraced the work of Philip K. Dick. When was K. Dick's first novel published?
I think he started writing short stories around the 1950s. A lot of his major stuff came out in the 1960s and then the 1970s, and he died in the 1980s.
Okay, so they certainly overlapped. But yeah, I mean, it was that kind of thing. I mean, K. Dick certainly has there's a Kafkian influence there. You can see Kafka in there. But I think there is this problem of the lack of universalization in Adorno's work. But this goes back a bit to Kant, and it's all like, the experience of looking at natural beauty for Kant proves that there is such thing as a common human experience, because in the moment when you're looking at natural beauty, you're not able to really define what you're looking at. He's talking about like a mountain range, like something not like going in a garden and looking at the grass on your lawn, but something that is radically different from your everyday experience, in which you can't really measure or discern what you're looking at. And at that point, he says that your cognitive faculties get kind of suspended and you can't make a judgment. And because you can't make a judgment, you must suspect that experience will be the same for everybody, because it's judgments which differentiate our experiences. And I think Adorno is the same. People say that, so he talks about Schomburg, Mahler, Kafka, Edgar Allan Poe, Samuel Beckett. These things can't be universalized. A great many people don't go to concerts or plays, etc. But he's talking about it in the Kantian sense that if you were to see it, and you may actually, I suppose, arguably need an education in those things, or at least so far as you wouldn't be intimidated by those experiences. But if you were to be able to comfortably see those things, then you would get this experience that Adorno is talking about, of being shocked into a realization of your subjectivity. Excuse me. So yeah, that's the thing. I don't know that you can expect anyone to really point to an actually universal experience in a society that is so atomized. In the sense of like, hey, here's one that we're all going to feel and we all can. It's going to have to be something that you have to go and find. And, supposing you did then find it, you would have that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there is a universal experience created by the culture industry in capitalist modernity. It's one of apathy, disenchantment, and depoliticization, which is part of the problem, right? But I think you're absolutely right to emphasize the kind of Kant connection there. Now, Adorno was infamously very, very critical of Kant in certain respects, and I think rightly so. The emphasis on transcendental subjectivity as the basis of morality, the kind of idea that we can be self-legislatures who are rationally independent of our relations with others, all that stuff needs to be criticized. But I think at the core of a Kantian kind of aesthetics is this idea that what makes something truly worthy as a work of art is precisely the fact that it is universalizable, right? That if you and I look at a piece of art that is a great work of art, we're going to have a similar reaction. And of course, for Kant, this is important as a basis for something like Republican politics, because that allows us to deliberate about it on the basis of a kind of shared sensation, right? Whereas if you experience art one way and I experience it the other, there's really no way for us to deliberate and hash out our understanding of it together. right? Now, moving from that to the kind of problem with reactionary art, one of the things that Adorno points out in this book and elsewhere, right, is that what's distinctive about the kind of artwork that's emphasized by people like Heidegger is that it does not belong to everyone, right? You need to be an authentic German in order to appreciate the true glory and the kind of metaphysical necessity that's embedded in German art, whereas everyone else is too crass, too embedded in modernity, or lacks the kind of spiritual acumen for these kinds of insights, right? And this is, of course, what makes it a kind of reactionary kind of aesthetics, because it stratifies the world into those who are capable of getting the message and the vast majority who aren't, right? And this is, of course, also occluded in many ways by all these vague references to authenticity, and only some people can be authentic, and only some people will get the message. And Adorno militates, I think, very rightly against that.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, that's I suppose what people would say. He militates against it, but then how can he really be militating against it? Because he requires that people, in order to have an Adornian moment of authenticity, although he wouldn't call it that, obviously, you would have to see certain things. But we've already kind of gone through that. We've already gone through why we don't think that's really a problem. Or if it's a problem because there's not equal access to these experiences. That's not really Adorno's fault.
No.
That's the kind of thing. That's something that he's trying to address. So just thinking about this aura that Adorno addresses. Well, I don't think we actually even said this yet. Okay, so Adorno talks about the aura. So a kind of aura that surrounds jargon. So words used by politicians. Like the other day, Boris Johnson said in his speech to the annual Conservative Party conference. So it's probably his biggest speech of the year. He said that we need to kind of revive the spirit of Britain. And that made me think of, precisely the kind of language that Adorno is using here, or Adorno is referring to here, rather. References to spirits, to auras, the kind of things that the Nazis referred to. Actually, I'm talking about spirit. Aura is a term that Walter Benjamin used to refer to artworks having kind of a special quality that refers to their individuality and also to their provenance, to the kind of to their ownership, who owns them, where they're housed. So the Mona Lisa in the Louvre Museum in Paris has a kind of aura because it's the only Mona Lisa. But we won't go into Benjamin that much. But Adorno uses that term aura and says that both Heidegger has a kind of aura around the words he used. So he uses these quite kind of vague terms, but also advertising has this kind of aura and political jargon. Now, I just want to kind of ask, do perhaps internet memes have a kind of aura, or tweets or something? Because they present everything to you, but they don't really do anything. They leave us with problems. So there's this whole generation that are kind of becoming politicized around internet memes, which I think is a great thing, as I've said in various places. But at the same time, they're kind of left with very vague kind of notions of what Adorno might say or what Mark Fisher might say. And is that not perhaps dangerous? I mean, what do you think of that? Because you're kind of involved in the online left.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating set of questions, right? And this idea of an aura or the kind of mysticism that's associated with reactionary language is something that I think a lot of leftists should be spending vastly more time on. And I'd like to point out that I think Frederick Jameson contemporaneously has the best works on this. And I'd really recommend everybody read his book, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, where he spends just an extensive amount of time deconstructing it. But very simply, one of the things that Adorno points out is that oftentimes the kind of jargon of authenticity and reactionary rhetoric generally, one should say, likes to present itself as kind of steely, more realistic, grounded, or embedded in the soil than the abstraction, so-called, of left-wing reasoning. And this is something you can trace back to Burke. But Adorno says if you actually break it down, you'll realize that oftentimes there's extraordinarily mystificatory quality to a lot of the rhetoric that reactionaries use. Like you just point out, the spirit of the nation. You could ask yourself, what the hell does that even mean, right? And the reason that it appeals to people is precisely because it's a jargon that plays to people's one-dimensional sympathies, to use the Marcusean term, right? You think about it, on the one hand, it appeals to people's sense of narcissism, right? That I'm part of an in-group, I'm special, I belong to and embedded in this extraordinarily heroic nation that elevates me above other people. Or on the other hand, there's this one-dimensional sense of decline, fall, this notion that we need to nostalgically return to a period, all the kind of characteristics, if you want, that we now associate with undialectical thinking. And the lack of complexity and immediacy of this language is part of the appeal to mass society, right? Which is why it says you can see so much of this jargon of authenticity, despite its kind of pseudo-contrarianism, so easily appropriated by the advertising industry. You know, you can think about, you know, people saying, you know, be yourself and have the kind of Coca-Cola that you really want. You know, don't settle for any other Coca-Cola, right? Now, in terms of, excuse me, just water. How this impacts us today in kind of online left circles, I absolutely think that you can still see a lot of reactionary memes that appeal to the same kind of mystificatory ways of conceiving the world, albeit, you know, from a very different aesthetic standpoint. And how we can interrogate those is a very important task for the left today. One that I think is quite interesting is the appropriation, this is just me, of, say, Crusader imagery, right? So, for instance, back in the kind of late 2010s, Charles Martel was a very popular figure who was memed a lot by the far right. For those of you who don't know, Charles Martel was a Frankist leader who pushed back an incursion into Frankish territory by an invading Muslim army, really a raiding Muslim army. Historically, it wasn't actually that big a deal. It was kind of a minor skirmish to protect a monastery. But he's been kind of elevated through this mystificatory logic by the alt-right and to, you know, this Crusader king who fought against the invading Islamic hordes and saved Western civilization or whatever, right? And so Martel became kind of very strangely almost a kind of symbol for a lot of these reactionary sentiments that was widely disseminated online. And people who saw it could easily recognize the kind of code that they were meant to, you know, kind of react or respond to very viscerally.
Okay, yeah, okay. I mean, I suppose we could see like this kind of aura as Adorno describes it in right-wing memes, because that kind of, you know, that very closely maps on to what he's saying about Heidegger. You know, if we, well, because Heidegger was basically right wing. I mean, it's that simple. But I mean, also the whole kind of thing Adorno is saying, the kind of argument he's making about return to the soil, you kind of can discern that in some right wing movements pushed by the meme community. But I think just memes in general. I mean, there's something interesting you said, is because, you know, you talked about an abstract language as opposed to these memes which point kind of very clearly to how things should be, and things should be kind of nice and, you know, neat, living in a rural community with your kind of cottagecore lifestyle, with your, you know, with your trad wife or whatever. I think you're right. There is a distinction between that and something more abstract that, in its abstraction, you know, kind of brings forth uncertainty, and then out of uncertainty maybe good things could come. So Adorno's more on the abstract side, and I think there is an argument that memes are abstract in their totality, not individually very often. So that, like, the total sum of all memes might actually confound people enough to make people kind of think and then move away from these kind of oversimplistic, romanticized visions of how we should live. I wonder whether we could actually just make abstract memes, literally, which is an idea I pushed in both my last books. But I think that's very difficult. I don't know, because, you know, algorithms make us look at things very quickly. So we tend to consume, you know, quick statements, or be captured more by very quick, bold statements that don't favor abstraction, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, I am not a visual artist, right? So if people are going to start emailing me or messaging me being like, what kind of memes should I create? My suggestion will be to turn them over to you, since I imagine you'd be much more versatile.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I make memes. I run these platforms with Adam Ray Adkins. We have an Instagram, the Acid Left Instagram, and a YouTube. I mean, but the thing is, we make memes and they get viewers and whatever, and we think that we're pushing things a little bit in the right direction. And a lot of people who by now are just involved in deliberate sarcasm for kicks, and a lot of the left has gone that way. You know, the right's been that way for years. A lot of the left has gone that way recently. But, you know, what would actually be like an abstract meme, or what I call a slow meme, that kind of could slow down our consumption and give us time to think and reflect in the way that Adorno would like us to. I just don't know. I mean, we're kind of like developing that, but I'd like someone else to come up with it, because I have my work cut out coming up with theory as well. But if anyone out there can think of what a slow meme would be, or an abstract meme would be, that would be great. But I am actually doing a lesson. I'm actually running a course with the New Centre in January. It does cost money, but it's cheap compared to universities in the States and the UK, certainly. But it's a short course with a few lessons, and it's on acid communism and art, and it involves meme making. It basically responds to what kind of art we should be making as leftists today. So yeah, hopefully, we'll get some answers from that between me and the students.
Yeah, I hope so. I just want to pick up on one of the things that you said, though, which is this characterization of abstract art, right, as inherently progressive, right? And I think we need to be very careful here, because one of the things that many conservatives and reactionaries criticize leftists for is precisely this fascination with abstraction, which kind of seeds the notion of the concrete or the immediate to them, right? Which is a big concession if you think about it, right? And I don't think we should grant them that. And the reason is this, right? One of the for a long time, conservatives have claimed that they're more realistic than leftists. And to a certain extent, there is truth to that in this very narrow sense only. Because conservatives and reactionaries often see themselves as defending the status quo or what's been existed before, they can claim to be more realistic than leftists because they're defending something that either is or was at the very least, right? The problem with that, of course, is how that abstracts away from the movement of temporality, this dialectical transition through history, and presumes that it's necessary that things either stay the way they are or go back to the way they were, right? And in this sense, it's a very abstract way of thinking about things, because it wants to calcify the moment that we live in, or a moment that we did live in permanently, and insulate it from change, right? Whereas I think progressives actually, through the power of abstract art, demonstrate the fact that history is always moving towards the future, and that there's a huge amount of contingency in human life because we can remake society to be something different. Which is, I think, the fundamental lesson, amongst others, of dialectical materialism, and precisely why it's actually more realistic and engages in more concrete forms of analyses than these kind of pseudo-concrete and pseudo-realistic kind of philosophies put forward by conservatives, right, and other reactionary thinkers. So I think that's extremely important. Now, Heidegger, in his case, is more complicated, because if you think about his notion of ecstatic time and the kind of tripartite dimensions to it, and Adorno points this out elsewhere, right? It has this kind of quasi or pseudo-dialectical quality to it. And it can be appropriated by people like Marcuse and put to those kind of purposes. But Heidegger's own inclinations almost always led him to just emphasize two dimensions of temporality, the past and the present, right? And there's this idea that we need to restore the past to the present if we're going to have a benevolent National Socialist future, right? And I think that we should be emphatically reject that and try to be more consistent in our futurity and our sense of the transitions that inevitably must take place over time than Heidegger himself was.
Okay, but I mean, just to kind of clarify, but do you see abstraction as maybe being some kind of impediment to that, or at least from the public perspective?
I think that really depends, right? I mean, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, right? I'm not going to sit there and say these forms of art are inherently insurrectionary or progressive or whatever it happens to be, because I think that would actually be a very anti-Adornian attitude to take, since, of course,
I'm just thinking whether you implied that the public might find abstract art difficult, and they may feel that it suggests that the left don't really have a solid, concrete plan.
Oh, I see. Okay. Absolutely. That is a danger, right? One of the dangers is precisely because the intention of a truly radical abstract art is to reveal the contingency both of the immediate present and of the future, right? By exposing, for that matter, in many cases, the contingency of the past and how it kind of emerged, right? It's extremely difficult to move from this emphasis on contingency to then conceive of what possible future that we want, precisely because it opens a space of freedom for us to ask ourselves those kind of difficult questions, right? And this is why a lot of people respond, I think, to abstract art, genuinely radical abstract art, with a certain degree of perplexion, because it doesn't lend itself to easy answers, easy solutions, or to use the Marxist phrase, recipes for the cook shops of the future, right? Now, that doesn't mean I think we should abandon that, because I think it's absolutely necessary as an aesthetic complement to the desire for radical reform. But what we need to do is find a way to create forms of art that are sufficiently radical to break people out of the gridlock of thinking in prejudiced or past terms, while at the same time universal enough that this can be accessible to a broad audience and will inspire many people to think this way, right? And one of the problems I've had with various kinds of art projects that are inspired by people like Adorno is precisely that, almost ironically, they become only the purview of an elite set of intellectuals who are capable of interpreting them in this manner, while most people just look at that and say, basically, what the fuck is that? I have no idea, right? And we need to be a lot better than that if we're not going to become, in many ways, just as elitist and withdrawn from actual politics as the people that we're often critical of.
For sure, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm just thinking of TV in the 60s and 70s in the UK. Actually, there was one of the essays in Ghost of My Life, Mark Fisher's collection that was published in his lifetime, most of which comes from either K-Punk or magazine reviews and articles he wrote. But he writes about a TV program called Sapphire and Steel, which was like a kind of mix between a drama, like a drama happening in a household in the UK and a sci-fi, and it had these bizarre moments and had elements also going back in time and kind of ghosts and stuff. But it was just so freaky. I saw some of it when I first heard of it when I read this in Ghost of My Life, but then I looked it up on YouTube. So Sapphire and Steel, if you look it up, it's just really like off the wall and even a little bit disturbing watching it now. And I just think, yeah, it's interesting how there have been periods in TV history where there were like quite surreal things, on mainstream TV. Even Doctor Who, if you look at the early episodes, were quite bizarre. And it's interesting how that would have been, well, certainly my parents' generation. And if you think about how they parented, it was a lot more open, their attitude towards parenting, than the previous generation. So who knows, maybe this kind of infiltration of abstract culture and literature as well, and the hippie movement into mainstream culture might have had an impact. And certainly there has been a moment of liberalization. I mean, in the best sense of the word, rather than neoliberalization, and a kind of left-wing turn post-war that coincided with far-out art, measured, against, conventional art or the kind of art that Heidegger would push. So, I think there is room for that kind of thing, but it's how do we bring that back into the mainstream? Of course, it is on the internet, and the internet you can do anything, and you get like movements like vaporwave, this kind of music movement which borrows from the 1980s, which also has visual elements. You can Google vaporwave on YouTube, not for you because I guess but for the viewers' benefit. Most of you will also know, but anyway, vaporwave, you get these moments, but the thing about the internet is it just kind of muddies everything. It's great at kind of like not co-opting in the old capitalist sense of like turning everything into a product that could be sold. Although that also happens. It's not like the thing of Che Guevara appearing on mugs and watches. It's more subtle. It's just this way that the internet moves so fast that you can't really stop it long enough to have a cogent thought. And that's kind of the worry. Otherwise the internet would be the place to build up a new abstract and perhaps psychedelic kind of movement. But yeah, I think we have to overcome certain problems with the algorithm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where Adorno and Horkheimer's work on the culture industry is in many ways more necessary than ever before, right? Although, of course, it needs to be complemented by a recognition that it's not the 1950s and 60s anymore, and we have all kinds of new media like the internet that warrant extraordinary interrogation based on their own merits and demerits, right? But I absolutely think that we can see various kinds of revolutionary or insurrectionary art, both within the recent past and in the present. The danger being, of course, that these very well can be co-opted by the culture industry and pushed towards more reactionary or pacifying purposes, right? So one of the ones that my friend Shalon Van Tang points out very often, is if you look at things like 1980s and 1990s hip hop, which I think it actually has enjoyed a resurgence in people like Kendrick Lamar, for example, right? So, yeah, big fan of his. It did have this kind of insurrectionary quality to it, where I genuinely critiqued the past to mobilize people in the present to get them to conceive of a better future, right? Often by drawing upon narratives, experiences, and forms of artistic creation that had been obscured or not even known by the mainstream, right? Danger being, of course, that this was rapidly appropriated by the culture industry and essentially pacified and neutered, right? So that then flash forward a couple of years and you just get things like, Kanye West or whatever it happens to be, right? And I think that Mark Fisher pointed out in his book, Ghosts of Our Lives, that trip hop might have fulfilled a similar function in the 1990s if it had been given the time in the UK to kind of metastasize into a genuine aesthetic movement, which it very well could have. But instead what you found was the kind of neoclassicism of Britpop that became ascendant. And so the kind of revolutionary potential that one saw in trip hop was quickly kind of marginalized by the culture industry. And this much more kind of reactionary or even just third wave kind of music that you saw in bands like Oasis kind of moved to the fore instead, right?
Yeah, I mean,
which isn't to say I dislike Oasis.
I remember that essay in Ghost of My Life, and I remember the trip hop in the UK in the 90s when it came out. I had some vinyl like Portishead and Tricky vinyls, and it was kind of all skewed towards kind of Cool Britannia and New Laddism. Basically, Cool Britannia was a kind of media rebranding of Britain that was kind of undertaken in cooperation with Blair's New Labour. This New Laddism was basically, but it's kind of coinciding with that. Maybe it started a little bit before, but kind of like a new lad culture. So, boys being boys. And that all kind of like threw people off the otherwise much more interesting path of trip hop and kind of bits of US grunge coming through, the more interesting bits.
Yeah, or I even say some of the more interesting bands in Britpop that you don't really hear about anymore, like Suede, for example, right? Suede had a really interesting way of playing with sexual mores and even kind of proto-analysis of gender roles, right? But you never hear about them.
Yeah, it's funny because it's true, because that was the music, it was always played in the clubs as well, Suede. But then this whole laddism, it kind of threw everybody into things like the 1996 Euro Cup and the 1998 World Cup. So even if you were like really into that kind of underground, well, not really underground, but but there's this culture which was maybe questioning more the mainstream, you ended up kind of getting that mixed up with football culture and three lines on a shirt and Vindaloo. I don't know if it means anything to you, but there was this song Vindaloo, which was kind of very kind of laddie song.
And I should say again, I mean, I love Oasis. My wife and I both liked it a lot. So it's not like, I'm not subject to these bouts of nostalgia like everyone is. It's kind of like McDonald's, right? I appreciate it's not good for me, but every now and then.
True, but there was no doubt that Oasis and Blur and everything that really did kind of like dampen what grunge might otherwise have become.
Yeah.
Even in the UK, and to call it grunge is not perhaps right because Cobain hated the term grunge. But in any case,
the same thing is true in the US, right? I mean, you had a lot of these kind of proto-punk bands like Nirvana, I was about to say Stone Temple Soundgarden, or even Pearl Jam, right? And flash forward just a couple of years, you get the Goo Goo Dolls. Right?
Yeah, or even it kind of went through Green Day and Offspring. It looked kind of promising even then, although they sounded a bit whiny and a little bit more mainstream in their production. But then it kind of went from that into I don't know what, but it got pretty horrible, horrific quite quickly. MTV totally changed in that period. Although I don't think MTV was ever like part of the vanguard. I
mean, you look at the distinction between Rage Against the Machine and Linkin Park, right?
Yeah, exactly. Linkin Park. Day, right? I'm thinking Linkin. Yeah, exactly. I think like Green Day and Offspring to Linkin Park through Korn maybe. But yeah, that all definitely happened. But yeah, before we
it's a bit of a blur
go
when
off
you think
into like
90s, right?
before we go off on a complete tangent there, although that was good. All right, so I guess we're coming up to the hour. So I was going to say your assessment of the online left, but we kind of did that already, and that would be like a massive topic. So maybe if you want to say anything about that, but otherwise, future books and projects. I know you've got something in the line for Zero Books. What are you doing lately? What can we expect from you coming up?
Yeah, I'll just give the Cole's notes. So I have a new book monograph coming out, academic book called The Emergence of Postmodernity, The Center Cannot Hold, which is kind of a sequel to the Rise of Postmodern Conservatism book. I actually think it's my best book so far, just grading on my own continuum, not against anyone else. So I encourage people to check that out. Release date should be soon. There's also a tiny little book for Zero called A How-To Guide to Cosmopolitan Socialism, being introduced by our own Ben Burgess, right? Release date should be sometime next year. And then we have, of course, the Nietzsche collection for Palgrave, which I am editing, but I am just contributing one slim essay to. And I know you're making a contribution to that also, as is Ben and several of our other comrades. So people should check that out. A lot of discussion going on about, Nietzsche's politics. Should we look at Nietzsche's politics more closely? I think we should. And this is intended to be a pretty hefty intervention in that vein. We don't have a release date for that because it was just announced, but I'm really excited about it. I think that people will really get a lot from it.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be involved, and it's great to have the opportunity to look at Nietzsche in depth again, because I have looked at him. I actually wrote about him as part of my PhD like many moons ago, and I'll be looking at Nietzsche and Adorno, I think, as we discussed actually. But great to have you here. I'm just thinking you have a podcast, or you're on the podcast, Plastic Pills.
So people should check us out at the Pill Pod or Plastic Pills. We also do critical theory analyses, but we try to shake things up every now and then with some more fun stuff. So recently we did one on Herman Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener. And I think we're doing an analysis of The Chair, the Netflix series about academic and university life. And that'll be fairly soon, so people can check us out.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, Matt, brilliant conversation. Thank you very much, and have a happy Canadian Thanksgiving. I don't know if you celebrate it like that, but have a good day on Canadian Thanksgiving.
Cheers.
Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you have been enjoying our content, please consider registering your desire with the algorithm by liking and subscribing. This really does help us grow and reach a wider community. If you would like to support our work of documenting and nurturing the rise of post-capitalist desires, become a patron. This allows us to continue research-based memes, podcasts, and videos, as well as up our production value. Patrons receive early views of videos, exclusive content, and more, including physical art and the ability to directly influence our research topics. The building of a better world happens on many fronts. Turn on, tune in, and shape a future collective reality.